The trade imbroglio with the Chinese communists has not gotten as much attention recently because of everything else going on with quote-unquote shutdowns of the federal government and no kings rallies and pardons and commutations and Middle East peace deals and all of that. But it's still very real as the Chinese Communist Party has gotten pretty aggressive in withholding rare earths from American companies, and this has triggered an escalation of both rhetoric and proposed tariffs. Trump was on Maria Bartiromo over the weekend, and he had this to say about those Chinese communists, including his friend, in quotation marks, President Xi.
This subject, it's a very complex subject, but China has ripped us off from day one. And, Richard Nixon, he allowed this to happen. He was the one, he opened China, and I said, is that good or bad? You tell me. He unleashed it. And we have a very strong adversary, and they only respect strength.
The export controls I mentioned on things like lithium batteries, Trump characterized as sinister and hostile. But the question, I suppose, is should we take the lead from American business elites like NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, or those that have a more cynical view of the Chinese communists, like, say, Palantir Chief Technology Officer Shyam Sankar, who argues that those who are taking a dovish approach to the Chinese Communist Party, like Jensen Huang, who said it doesn't have to be all us or all them, it could be us and them. There's still the opportunity to collaborate here and have a mutually beneficial relationship. To that, Shyam Sankar writes, a nice sentiment, but Chinese Communist parties don't believe it. They often speak soothingly of their country's peaceful rise, quote unquote, but the party's history and actions tell a different story. No kidding. The Communist Party believes China and the U.S. are locked in a great struggle for mastery. In this worldview, it is enough for China to rise. The U.S. must fall. Sankar goes on to say China is already waging war against us in many ways. These include withholding rare earth minerals, attempting to smuggle crop diseases into the U.S. to harm our food supply, pre-positioning electronic devices to cripple American telecom and emergency response systems. We talked a little bit about that last week, that 60 Minutes piece. And subsidizing the production of and export of chemicals used to manufacture fentanyl. Of course, we know the collusion with Mexican drug cartels. Beijing's goal, writes Sankar, is to weaken us while mobilizing for a future showdown we would lose. China's military aims aren't secret. The People's Liberation Army does target practice on mock-ups of U.S. aircraft carriers. Beijing's economic strategy complements this goal. China spends roughly 5% of gross domestic product on industrial subsidies. This is conquest economics meant to drive competitors out of business and make them dependent on China. Beijing's standard playbook is to accept Western businesses until it has developed a credible challenger, then to exclude Western companies from the Chinese market and flood overseas markets with Chinese goods. Business leaders who play along with Beijing call to mind Upton Sinclair's observation that it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it. No, I don't know if I'd be quoting Upton Sinclair, but I take the point. Along those lines, it was an interesting discussion in a recent episode of the All In podcast with these tech impresarios like Chamath Palihapitiya and David Sachs, Trump's crypto czar. This is what they had to say about Chinese Communist Party capital allocation.
A lot of people don't know this historical artifact, which I think is so fascinating, which is I don't think China is a rising power. I think China is a reascending power. And the reason I say that is if you go back to 1500 to now, over all of those years, China had the world's largest GDP 70% of those years.
Yep.
70%. So if you think about it in that context, especially as a Confucian society, I think the Chinese think about this as, hold on, this is reasserting the dominance that we've always had. And I think if you start to look at it through that lens, that's why they view the blending of public-private partnerships, the organizations that go and help backstop private companies in China. The other interesting thing, which I learned studying China, is how they allocate capital. The capital allocation system is both rigid, but it's incredibly flexible. What do I mean? The way that China allocates money is the following. You have Xi Jinping and his close circle of people. They dictate the priorities, right? I would think there was an article, Nick, you can find it. But Xi is personally right now helping to draft the 5-year business plan of China. But what happens is it goes from that central group of like 7, 8, 9 people to the Politburo. And when it gets approved by the Politburo, it gets sent to all the provinces, and then it gets sent to the prefectures. So an example was in 2006 and 7, when they decided to prioritize EVs, what you effectively have is a cascading set of venture capitalists who are operating against the national priority, and then they are rewarded for it. And so you essentially have 300 VCs running around, organizing human capital in all of these different provinces against all of these different priorities. And at the end of that, you get a BYD, or you get a Xiaomi, or you get these great companies. And I think that that is what's so daunting if you think about it. So that's another thing that
was Chamath Palihapitiya on that. Let's fold Jim Iuorio into the conversation. Jim Iuorio, the host of the Future's Edge podcast, special contributor to wirepoints.org, all things Illinois policy related, and, of course, the proprietor of Brandt's Restaurant in Palatine, and maybe a future location in Beijing. I'm not sure. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, you know, where do you come down on sort of the, I mean, to use an imprecise dichotomy, you know, should we be more dovish or more hawkish with President Xi and the boys?
Well, I love the fact that Chamath, that's how you pronounce his name, right? Chamath. I love the fact that he brought up the 500-year history, because everyone thinks, you know, since 1960, 1970, that China's this big rising power. In their mind, they were the rising power before. I think that's interesting. So when you have to break down, because the rare earth metals thing is such a frustrating discussion, because let's just dial back the clock 30 years. And we're talking about rare earths, but we can talk about the entire supply chain, which touches China from every angle. But the rare earths part of it is that rare earths are not rare. They're not particularly, they're difficult and clumsy to mine and refine, and there's clear environmental issues. So what was our answer here when the environmental left started to rise up and be very, very vocal, is that we move that all to China. However, that far left still uses their iPhones, still basks in the luxury of a defense system that's best in the world. So it's just like we pushed the problem somewhere else and then acted like it went away. So there's been 30 years of that, and we can't get anything done here anymore. If we try to open up a mine, and we did just open a mine a couple of weeks ago that makes antimony, which I had never heard of antimony until now, but it's apparently something very important in defense. But if we try to do those things, we are going to get stopped by the environmentalists at every turn. So it's going to be a very difficult thing to do. We had Vivek Ramaswamy on our show, The Future's Edge, about 2 years ago, and when he was clearly part of the Trump team, well, he's actually running for president at the time, but he made the point that if we are going to reroute everything away from China, we are talking about 5 to 7 to maybe even 10 years of a lower standard of living in that transition period. So the question I ask you, I guess, is do we here have the stomach for that, or are we going to vote out any officials who try to push the thing? It's a huge issue.
Well, you know, here's the thing. I mean, just listening to Chamath talk about the capital allocation. Yeah, I mean, okay, so they've had some wins from their sort of central planned venture capitalism, which is kind of a contradiction in terms. But at the end of the day, I would suggest that Xi's 5-year plans are probably don't have any better success rate than Stalin's, which induced a famine in Eastern Europe. And that he's no better at picking winners and losers than Terry McAuliffe was with Solyndra and other green energy gambits a generation ago. So, I mean, what if that's if how Chamath described it is accurate, and I believe it is, then what are we afraid of? I mean, I go back to what he said. They're a reascending power, but there's also this question that we have to answer. For those who want to be more hawkish about China is, look, why have they always punched below their weight? why don't they have the economic power that 1.5 billion people would suggest they have? 5 times more population than the United States. Well, it's because they're communists and because the means of production are controlled by the state.
Because they don't have the beauty and the power of capitalism.
Yeah. So then I'm a little challenged to understand why this is. I understand they're a hostile actor, and I understand that their illegalities and their incursions and efforts to destabilize anything from agriculture to our power grid need to be addressed. But I mean, why are we so concerned about their ascent or reascent? It's not going to happen.
Well, because I think what you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, and I agree with what you're saying, is that the way we handled the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union was to handle it economically instead of any sort of war.
Yes, I mean,
I like what you're saying.
As George Will famously said, the Cold War is over and the University of Chicago won it.
Exactly, right, exactly, no doubt about it, right. But what you're saying takes some time. So the question becomes, look in a mirror here. Do we have the wherewithal to withstand some difficult time while we're trying to cut off China from the global supply chain, which is not going to be an easy thing? And then will everybody just get voted out and we'll be back to square one? That's what I think is a possibility. I like what you're saying, and I actually think what you're saying that's my base case, is that they will falter economically and it'll turn into a rout, and we will make them a little less powerful at the same time we're rerouting through India and Vietnam and other countries that might be more friendly to us. But it takes some time, and the question is, will the American people put up with it?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting piece about not just onshoring, but inshoring. And I wonder about this dynamic, what you think, if this is sort of a one-off or this is something that may be gaining more appeal for American companies. Small towns like Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Provalis, which provides big companies with outsourced services such as insurance claims processing, and cybersecurity monitoring, is expanding revenue by 35 to 40% a year with an unusual playbook, investing in rural America. The company has around 250 open jobs now, with hundreds more in the pipeline. Instead of locating its service and technology jobs in metro areas or sending them to countries such as the Philippines, Provalis seeks out small towns, mostly in the South, looking for places where the average individual income hovers around 30 grand. There, according to company executives, Provalis finds people who are eager for jobs that will teach them 21st century skills but who have few opportunities. It's a stab at reversing decades of disinvestment in rural communities as a model for creating jobs in often overlooked pockets of the economy. That's interesting.
I think it's fantastic. I think it's totally interesting. But here's what I worry about. And just think about the minimum wage thing when they wanted to make it 15 or 50 or 100 or whatever the crazies wanted to make it. They were not making any distinction between Manhattan and rural Oklahoma for that minimum wage, which I think it just shows this level of stupidity that it's astounding. But so I worry about the regulators coming in and regulating the heck out of this. There's another thing I'd add to. You mentioned adding hundreds of jobs. When manufacturing left here, obviously hundreds of thousands of jobs left. If manufacturing came back, and I know you weren't talking about manufacturing specifically, it is much less labor intensive. Of course, there's construction and there's engineering jobs for programmers and things like that, but there's not the same sort of rural America jobs on the line, which that'll never come back, and nor do we want it to come back. But I think that is amazing. But the reshoring thing, again, I'm going back to the same thing, is these things take time. And will the American people be smart enough to know that we've changed lanes and now we're in the right lane pushing forward, but obviously not at the pace that everybody is used to in 2025 where it's instant gratification?
Well, can we have our cake and eat it too, in the sense of, can we take what I guess Sankar over at Palantir would characterize as a more dovish approach, the Jensen Huang sort of philosophy about the Chinese Communist Party, and at the same time continue to encourage American businesses to locate supply chains in countries that are not named China, and otherwise, again, win on the competitive battlefield because they have this 800-pound weight on their backs called the Chinese Communist Party.
So I think what you're saying is, could Donald Trump have been more subtle and nuanced? I don't think he really has much of a definition of what those words are. And again, I am a supporter. I think that the better way, I agree with Jensen Huang, I think it should have been gradual, because, and only because that's what the American people will vote for at the next election. That's just an opinion, of course, but any sort of really disruptive sort of thing, which is what we're going through now, might be. And I still, by the way, this whole thing, I'm just providing devil's advocate because I actually agree with you on a lot of this. I think this is the right way to go, and I think the American people are smart enough to realize that. I keep saying the American people. It sounds like I'm running for office. I want people who are listening. I am not running for office. But I think that it is going to work out. I just want people to understand what the downsides are, and the downsides are if people like you can't get the message out effectively, and I think you can. And I'm talking about the media and the pundits, because we being the logical thinking centers is always on the back foot because the media is always portraying things like everything is going to hell. And I hope that we can get over that. Does that make sense? That was a ramble, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So,
yeah,
so I got a market question, an asset allocation question, if you will. So what's the hedge, gold or crypto?
Well, why do we have to pick? Why can't we mountains?
Well, I only have so much. Jim, I'm not a billionaire like you. I only have so much money. I got to pick one.
No, even if you have $2 to invest, why can't you put $1 to each?
I could, I guess.
Of investing now has been taken away. There's not even money put in. I think that to answer your question, I still say 2/3 gold. No, 3/4 gold, 1/4 Bitcoin is my hedge. But I also include real estate and platinum, because they're all talking about the debasement trade now. If these people have been watching us on the Futures Edge or reading the Unfiltered Investor, we've been talking about the debasement trade for 4 or 5 years. So when J.P. Morgan starts to jump on and say, 20% gold, we as people who actually are nimble in the markets think, oh, shoot, are we in the last stage? And the answer to that is probably yes, but the last stage could last several years. I'm talking about the dollar debasement trade, and that's owning things that Dennis Gartman used to say would hurt if you dropped them on your foot. Although I don't say how you can drop real estate on your foot, but I think y'all get the message. But I think that trade is still good, and I think mostly gold and then some Bitcoin. And by the way, I barely even know what Bitcoin is. Here's what I do know is that the biggest names are broadening their footprint into the crypto space. I'm not going to be on the sidelines for that.
Mm-hmm. And on gold, I mean, some people suggest that sort of there's a little bit of induced hysteria about hard money that is driving gold to all-time highs. It's a little bit of a sugar high based on, as I said, sort of trying to foment concern of false, hype anxiety. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's no? I mean, this is a smart play.
No, I think it's been a smart play for a couple of years. Once central banks started really stockpiling gold at a rate they hadn't done in 80 years, and that kind of all relates back to when we froze Russia out of the SWIFT payment system and froze up their dollar-denominated assets. Global central banks were like, oh, wow, they can do this pretty heavy-handed thing, so let's buy more gold and get out of some dollars. I'm not a big de-dollarization trade, but it's moved. 64% of global reserves were held in dollars in 2017. Now it's only 56%, and what's taken the place is gold. I actually am giving a speech, I think it's 2 weeks from today in New Orleans, because I think that the new play is owning physical gold, but then hedging physical gold within the paper market, GLD, or the futures contracts. And because I think the next move, and again, the last 2 months in gold, I think is the fear of missing out trade, and it's moving down to the retail level. But just knowing that we're in the last stages of it doesn't mean you can predict when it's over. We still could have 2 years of going higher in gold, which I actually think we will.
Jim Iuorio is host of the Futures Edge podcast, special contributor to wirepoints.org, and the proprietor of Brandt's Restaurant in Palatine. Jim, thanks as always.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And Jim joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
If you have an IRA or 401k, this is a message you really need to hear. In just the last 2 years, the price of 1 troy ounce of silver has more